Well, joining me now is Gary Dunion from the World Development Movement and Denis Drechsler from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in Rome to discuss whether banking speculation is forcing the price of food commodities such as cocoa and wheat to rise. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me. Gary, let me start with you. Do you think we are at the early stages of a food price crisis, a global food price crisis?
That's certainly possible. What we're seeing now is not dissimilar to what we saw in the most recent food price crisis between 2006 and 2008, which is that you had a genuine rise in the fundamental price of food commodities. In that case, we had poor wheat harvests, particularly in developing countries. In this case, we've got a very poor wheat harvest and fires and so on in Russia. And what tends to happen then is that speculators will latch onto that and drive the price higher. Now, we've had price warnings.
Let me just jump in there. When you say speculators are pushing the prices to rise, how do they do that?
They do that by essentially gambling that the price will continue to rise. That sends a strong market signal that it will, and that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And by speculators, I mean people who are trading in derivatives on the price of food. So that's a paper contract which is based on the future price of food.
Dennis, do you think that food should be speculated against in this way? Should it be traded like this?
Well, if you present speculation in the way as it was just done, possibly not. But we need to understand that speculation fulfills multiple functions and also very fundamental functions for the actual producers of agricultural goods, who oftentimes look for ways to protect against the risks that they're facing in the production cycle. And by selling futures, commodity futures, for example, they can find a way to protect against these risks. So speculation also fulfills very important functions.
Okay, then let me ask you a question. Do you think that food speculation could ever cause food prices to decrease?
Well, certainly there might be an effect, although we should be very careful in jumping to any conclusions here. The evidence that you find, the analysis that have been conducted are very inconclusive. You find some that say, yes, clearly there has been an effect, also driving up prices, and maybe they have caused the food price crisis that we witnessed about 2 years ago. But you also find lots of studies that claim exactly the opposite. So certainly we need to have much more information. We need to have more knowledge, and more analysis needs to be undertaken in order to really answer this question definitely, and also come up with the right policy measures in order to prevent this, if indeed there is a correlation.
I mean, in many ways, Gary, I mean, that's a very good point that Dennis makes, because the research has been pretty inconclusive. I mean, the OECD just this month have come out saying that there might not actually be necessarily a relationship between food speculation or banking speculation and rise in food prices. But you disagree with that?
I do disagree with that. There are 1 or 2 studies that make that point, but I know that Denis' organisation, the Food and Agriculture Organisation, studied this in 2009. Their conclusions were wide-ranging as to the causes of food prices, but they certainly felt that one of the reasons was speculation. We know that Merrill Lynch, who of course a participant in this and is not a campaigner with an axe to grind, assessed that even at 2006, at the start of that spike, that speculation was causing food to trade at about 50% above what the fundamental price would have been.
But what do you say to what Dennis had said, that actually speculation can have beneficial effects?
Well, he's absolutely right. And speculation actually began, as he says, as a way for farmers to insure against locust infestations, bad weather, that kind of thing. And it began in the United States. And in the United States, through the teens and particularly 1920s, you had what began as a very sensible and effective model of risk reduction used as a gambling chip by Wall Street bankers. And that, of course, ultimately ended in the Wall Street crash. That kind of behaviour ended in the Wall Street crash. And that's when you got the regulations that are now being eroded again. No,
but it's an interesting point, Dennis, because we are beginning to see now in financial markets that excessive speculation is beginning to be curbed. But what I see that in food commodities, it's still very much so like the Wild West. Regulation hasn't really done very much there. It's still very much so an untouched market.
We need to know what is happening in these markets. What are the volumes that are traded? There need to be regulation that these things are disclosed, and then of course there need to be mechanisms in order to inform the public that oftentimes also even if this information is available, chooses not to be informed and simply follow blindly a trend. So I think we need to work on these both fronts, on the availability of this information, but also then on finding the right mechanisms in order to inform the public. Now, I wanted to come back to something that was said earlier about the self-fulfilling prophecy that you might have when you look at speculation, because there's simply a trend and you confirm this trend by jumping the bandwagon. I think the same is happening now if we start talking about a potential food crisis and a repetition of what we've seen in 2007, 2008. Again, I think this is more destabilizing the market than bringing in, a sense of rationality and looking at the fundamentals. Because what we've seen is, yes, there might be a potential shortfall in Russia and in other important exporters of wheat in this case, but the stocks are still plenty, and we have no reason to believe that at this moment, we have to fear anything similar to a situation that we faced 3 years ago. So
Right.
we should be a bit more careful in how we call these things.
Okay, but isn't, I suppose, part of the problem for food commodities is the fact that many investors in financial markets have decided to almost move their investment because of the financial crisis into food commodities, which they see as more safe?
That's exactly right. And for me, that's the main reason for the 2006-2008 spike. And it's obviously not something we're seeing right now, because it's not happening at the same time as the rest of the banking crisis we had at that time. At that time, investors were fleeing credit, so subprime mortgage packages, derivatives, and they were fleeing currency. And there were a lot of houses that were talking up commodities as a good, safe bet for that money. And that means that the way that commodities prices were responding, or commodities derivatives prices were responding, was based on, if you like, the market fundamentals of credit or of currency, not the market fundamentals of food. And that is why they have a very poor record in discovering, as they call it on the market, a fair price for food.
Okay, Dennis, last question to you. Speak to me a little bit more about why is it, in many ways, that investment in agriculture has been neglected?
Well, if I knew the reason, I would tell you right now, and,
I know, that's why it's the
and
last
we would all be
question.
happy. Certainly the FAO would be very happy if we knew the answer.
But,
the only thing
for a
we can do
while-
is to...
Sorry, I beg your pardon. For a while, the World Bank and the IMF were very anti-agriculture.
Yes, it has been a neglected sector, and I think we've been successful, especially with last year's, with the spike in the number of undernourished people in the world, but also with the global summit that we had last year here in Rome. I think we have successfully opened the eyes to these actors, development actors, that agriculture is something that they need to consider in the development strategies, that agriculture can really be a key for the broader development of a country. And this does not just mean that we provide the means that they can feed their people, but it can mean that this will actually be the basis for real development of these countries. So I do think there's been a rethinking. You see this also in the trend of official development assistance, which has been down as low as 5% of all these funds went into agriculture. Now there's a slight upward trend. I don't know if we will see the 20% that we had about 20 years ago, but even a movement to 10, 15% would already be a success, and the FAO will continue to argue in this direction.
Denis Drechsler in Rome, thank you very much for joining me, and Gary Dunion here in London, thank you also.
Thank you.